This evening we are really in the midst of something. And we are dealing with a subject which has taxed the ingenuity of some very able minds. Among them, Mr. Arthur Edward Waite. I think we need, in this case, to say a little something about the author of the book we are going to consider. Mr. Waite was one of the outstanding writers of his time in the otherwise neglected field of the esoteric arts and sciences. His production in this area was prodigious. And as author, editor, translator, and preface writer, he made available to English-speaking people many rarities of early philosophy and European mysticism that might not yet be available to us. We are most appreciative for his inspiration in contributing to the translation of the Museum Hermeticum, for example. And we likewise deeply appreciate his industry in making available the two large folio volumes on the alchemical writings of Paracelsus. We remember him also as the translator of the French transcendentalist Eliphas Levi. We also know that Mr. Waite was a mystic and poet in his own right, and his book of poems of Mystery and Vision is an entirely commendable work. We also know from his general literary style that he was a man of ability in these areas, and from his research material that he was by nature a good student. And with the available material in the library of the British Museum at his disposal, he has preserved for us a wonderful bibliography of authors, texts, and books that might otherwise remain comparatively unknown to the modern student. Down through the years, I have gradually assembled the greater part of his original reference material, so that probably 80% of the books that he quotes, particularly in the volume under consideration this evening, we have in the original editions. These different activities also relate to another line of his thinking. He was a prominent English Mason and wrote considerably on Freemasonry, including encyclopedic works dealing especially with the British point of view on things Masonic. He had very little sympathy for the American point of view on almost any subject, and was essentially first, last, and all the way along an English gentleman with a profound admiration for everything English. Well, as most of his authors were not English, this should not have caused any great amount of consternation. But in looking along and in following many of the difficult courses which he attempted to follow, we do not always find that we can come in accord with his conclusions. All through his writings, we find a peculiar note that detracts from the seriousness which the subjects might justify. For example, in his translations of the writings of the French transcendentalist Eliphas Levi, who was actually a French priest by the name of Abbé Louis Constant, Waite does an excellent translation, and then in the preface apologizes for the original author. He explains definitely that he is not to be held responsible for the innumerable mistakes made by the good abbé in his original texts. This is a rather curious point of view. We don't know who is on the defensive, but it looks as though Mr. Waite is very concerned over his reputation. This was love's labor lost, however, as the very field in which he was operating must inevitably have ruined his reputation outside of a small group of sympathetic friends. The corporate image of Mr. Waite therefore arises as an individual with a good scholarly mind and a powerful body of preconceptions. His work on the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross first appeared in 1924, and I secured my copy in the spring of 1925 when the book was still fresh from the press. Reading it at that time, I noticed in looking it over a few days ago, I made a couple of notes on the title page. A poor habit, but I didn't intend this book for resale. The note that is pertinent to the situation is my finding in the first reading of the book. Mr. Waite reasons from conclusions and not toward them. And this, I think, is generally his dilemma throughout nearly all of his writings. He is so desperately afraid that he will not be respectable. He is so desperately frightened lest his scholarship be questioned that he moves along in a state of caution that becomes, to a degree at least, a little ridiculous considering the nature of the subject matter. Of all his publications, I suppose this book, which was one of his last, might have caused him the greatest difficulty. He undoubtedly had been gathering notes on relative matters for a long time, as his first written work appeared in 1887. Therefore, we have a considerable literary career. Not too long ago, the original papers, manuscripts, and so forth of Mr. Waite were offered at auction and brought a substantial sum. I did not bid on them because most of the manuscripts had already appeared in book form. But throughout his writings, we find that caution leads him almost inevitably to a strong point of negation. In his effort to be sure that he is not supporting something that is not right, he finally ends up by supporting nothing. This is not unreasonable, considering the obscuration of the field, but it still leaves us with the mystery about which the book is built remaining unsolved. All he seems to be able to do with it is harvest the winds. This end in itself is not of great importance. The important thing is that he has preserved for us the necessary titles, names, and publication dates of practically every important text in the field. This makes possible that others may follow after him, and picking up the threads of his particular interests may unravel them further. Now, as the book deals primarily with the subject of the Rosicrucians, I think we should try to orient ourselves a little bit in his thinking on the subject. The burden of Mr. Waite's feelings the burden is that the Rosicrucian organization was a mystical society, completely and entirely esoteric, that almost every contender for a place in the membership of the society was either an optimist or a fraud, that actually practically every book written in the last 100 years on the subject of Rosicrucianism is a monstrous absurdity, that all authors, except himself, are highly prejudiced. He is different. He is just prejudiced against everybody. This situation must cause us to review a little some of his special findings in an effort, if possible, to see what we can do with the material he offers us, always remembering that his quotations are probably correct and his interpretations on them probably incorrect. We have a wonderful opportunity in reading such material to preserve our own reference frame. We can resist the temptation to drift along with our author. We can pause and reflect, and in this way perhaps attain considerable mental discipline out of a book which, if read without criticism, might prove rather disintegrating to a point of view. For example, early in his work, he begins to shatter the conclusions and foundations that had been built during the 18th, 19th, and the first decade of the 20th century. These conclusions pointed rather definitely to certain possible sources for Rosicrucianism. I concur with Mr. Waite fully in his realization that this society was not, as a society, an ancient institution, that all efforts to give it a mythological antiquity are essentially futile, that even with the best possible research, we are unable to trace it back earlier than the opening years of the 17th century. We must, however, clearly differentiate between Rosicrucianism as a formal organization and Rosicrucianism as a possible descent of mysticism which in its proper right goes back a very long time. If, therefore, we wish to assume that the principles apparently concealed beneath the enigma of the Rosy Cross, if we consider these principles as ancient, we will be well justified. If, however, we consider the organization to be ancient, we have absolutely no ground on which to stand. And I also am inclined to agree with Mr. Waite that we cannot permit psychic revelation to fill this gap. We cannot assume that someone in a trance is able to produce a valid history unless in that trance something is communicated by which reasonable investigation can be stimulated. The idea of trying to fill these gaps with romance will not actually advance any cause to any great degree. In the study of the origin of the society, most scholars have assumed that the original documents of the Rosicrucian Society were published by a German theologian who was the religious and spiritual counselor of the Duke of Wittenberg, one Johann Valentin André. Mr. Waite dismisses this concept as being entirely incredible because it would require that the so-called chemical marriage of Christian Rosenkreutz, one of the earliest documents of the Society, was written when André was only 24 years old. Mr. Waite regards this as an absurdity. He feels that a work of this pretension, of this depth, of this importance, could only have been the production of either a very mature person or one of a group having considerable knowledge in common. I read the chemical marriage of Christian Rosenkreutz, and this particular point of view that Mr. Waite advances does not seem to be valid so far as I am able to understand. André